Bitcoin white paper references 8 prior works, 3 of which the research scientist W. Scott Stronetta was a co-author of. In October 2021, Stronetta made a very interesting comment about Bitcoin.
But at the time you first saw the Bitcoin white paper, did you really think Bitcoin would succeed? Do you think it would grow? It was obviously very fringe in the beginning.
You know, I'm less concerned about whether something is fringe or not in the beginning. And the physicist in me, and I apologize for geeking out here for a second.
Oh, you're with the right people.
Says, you know, when you have a physical system, you describe the world in terms of an initial condition and a differential equation. And the starting point in a differential equation is not nearly so important as tuning the parameters of the differential equation. And in this case, it's the embedding of the incentives into the social system that is the real genius.
Physical systems, embedding incentives into social systems, initial conditions, tuning parameters of differential equations. What is this guy talking about? Let's see if we can write out this equation to help us understand what Stronetta says is the real genius of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a system that records transactions in what is known as a timestamp server. Timestamp servers efficiently ensure the integrity of digital records by using hashing algorithms to chain blocks of data together and widely publishing the block's hash. Timestamp servers are not unique to Bitcoin. They have been around since Stuart Haber and Scott Stronetta began working on them in the early 90s. What is novel about Bitcoin is the game-theoretic method it uses to implement the timestamp server on a peer-to-peer basis. Implementing a network of timestamp servers on a peer-to-peer basis means there is no central authority that controls what transactions go into the server's database or when they are written to the database. This leads us to several questions. 1. How do peers operating timestamp servers, commonly known as miners, agree on when transaction data is written to the database? 2. How do they reach consensus on what is written to the database? And 3. How can users of the system trust that the data miners are writing to this immutable timestamp server is valid? A proof-of-work system is used to determine when a block of transactions is added to the chain. This system requires miners to find an input to a hashing algorithm that results in a valid output. When a miner finds a valid solution, they will broadcast that solution, along with their collection of new transactions, to the network, and that block of transactions will be added to the chain. The proof-of-work difficulty is determined by a moving average that targets one new block roughly every 10 minutes. This answers our first question of when transactions are added to the timestamp server's database, but it also leads us to another important question. Why would anyone want to expend effort to mine a block? Miners are incentivized to support the network with what is commonly known as a block reward. The block reward consists of a number of new coins plus transaction fees. Let's use this block reward incentive to start our equation. We will call the block reward B sub r and calculate it by multiplying the number of new coins, N sub c, by the relative value per coin, V sub c, and then adding it to the number of transactions, N sub t, times the fee per transaction, F sub t. We can say that each block's reward is a function of these variables. Miners will know exactly how many new coins will be in each block, but they will have to make projections on the future value of coins, the number of transactions that will be in future blocks, and what fees users will be willing to pay per transaction when forecasting the value of future block rewards and deciding if that expected reward is incentive enough for them to expend effort. Miners can now estimate the benefit of operating a node, but they must also consider the cost of operating before deciding if they want to compete for block rewards. Let's write the next part of our equation, which measures the effort required to receive the block reward. We will call this effort the cost of operating, C sub O, and calculate it by adding the cost of validating, C sub V, to the cost of finding a proof of work solution, C sub P of W. Validating costs would be those costs directly associated with operating a timestamp server, while proof of work costs would be directly associated with competing for block rewards. These costs would consist of things like computer hardware and software, electricity, high bandwidth internet, facilities, and knowledgeable people. Now that we have a way to calculate the estimated block rewards and costs, we can do a cost-benefit analysis of operating a mining node. In this analysis, we will calculate the benefit-to-cost ratio of operating BCR sub O as the block reward divided by total operating cost. Miners will be profitable as long as the result is greater than 1. This equation is not expressed as a differential, but when we look at our variables, we see that some are derived from external variables or are functions of one another. For example, we can determine the value per coin by looking at the market price. We can see how the cost of validating is a function of the number of transactions per block because we will need to purchase more or less computing power to process more or less transactions. But the relationship we want to focus on here is how the total block reward directly impacts the proof of work cost. Miners compete for block rewards by being the first to find a valid proof of work hash. Hashing algorithms are one-way deterministic functions, meaning the only way to find a valid solution is through brute force, essentially entering numbers until one works. This also means the only way a miner can increase their probability of being the first to find a valid solution and win the block reward is by using more computing power to hash numbers faster. Bitcoin's design assumes miners will act as rational economic agents trying to maximize their return on investment. They will increase investment as the block reward goes up and decrease investment when the block reward goes down. These rational economic decisions will lead to what we are going to call the hash rate equilibrium. Let's write an equation to represent this equilibrium and put it on a graph to help us visualize the dynamics. The hash rate, h sub r, is equal to the total number of hashes, little h, that all competing miners run through the proof of work algorithm per second, little s. Miners will decide how much they are willing to invest in proof of work hashing based on what we are going to call the effective reward, E sub r. We will calculate the effective reward by subtracting the cost of validating from the total block reward. The hash rate will be a positively correlated function of the effective reward because rational miner investment in hash power will respond proportionately to changes in the reward. We will represent this correlation with a little m and say that the hash rate is equal to the proportionality times the effective block reward plus a constant little c as the initial hash rate when the block reward is 0. Proof of work cost will be a positively correlated function of the hash rate because miners' investment in hash power will respond proportionately to changes in the hash rate so that they can remain competitive while maximizing their return on investment. We will represent this correlation with a little n and say that the proof of work cost is equal to the proportionality times the hash rate plus a constant little c as the initial cost when the hash rate is 0. Our hash rate equilibrium will be where the proof of work cost equals the hash rate relative to the effective reward. Now that we have our equation, we can put this economic model on a graph to help visualize the relationship between the effective reward, proof of work cost, and the hash rate. We will put the hash rate measured in millions of hashes per second on the x-axis and the value of the effective reward and proof of work cost measured in US dollars on the y-axis. A block cannot be mined without any hash rate, So we'll set our starting point or initial condition at 10 megahashes per second with the effective reward and proof of work cost equal to $0. We chose this point because Bitcoin initially had no monetary value and many of the system's original enthusiasts already owned computers and had enough spare electricity that producing 10 megahashes per second would have cost them almost nothing. Let's first plot our cost equation so that we can see how an increase in hash rate will require an increase in proof of work cost. We will keep our model simple by setting the correlation n equal to 1, so that every additional megahash per second increases the cost by $1. Now, let's model how miners respond to the effective reward. Since our initial reward was 0, we can simplify the equation by removing the constant. To plot the relationship on our graph, we will invert the equation to express the effective reward as a function of the hash rate. We'll assume miners' response is perfectly elastic, meaning they'll supply exactly as much hash rate as the effective reward justifies, instantly adjusting to match the break-even point. This gives us a horizontal line across the graph. The height of that line will depend on the effective reward we want to model. For example, if the reward is $30, the hash rate equilibrium occurs at 40 megahashes per second. If the effective reward increases to $90, the equilibrium shifts to 100 megahashes per second. Let's give our model some real-world context by plugging a few variables into the equation. We will get our real-world numbers from the Bitcoin Statistics and Services site Coindance, which gives us information on all 4 of the active chains that can be linked back to Bitcoin's Genesis block. We will look at the BTC and BSV networks to give us 2 snapshots of the equilibrium on 21 May 2025. We can begin by looking at the 2 variables that make up the subsidy portion of the block reward, new coins and the value per coin. Coindance shows us that both networks were distributing 3.125 new coins each block. The market value of each BTC was $106,940, and the value of each BSV was $36 on this day. When we multiply the number of new coins by the value per coin, we see that the BTC subsidy for each block was $334,187.50. The BSV subsidy was $112.50. To see the fees portion of the block reward, we will look at Coindance's daily Bitcoin fee to block reward ratio chart. When we zoom into May 21st, we can see that the transaction fees only made up 1.6% of the BTC block reward and 0.027% of the BSV block reward on that day. Because fees were such a small part of the block reward and validating costs are a function of the number of transactions, we're only going to use the subsidy to represent our effective reward and assume the majority of costs are associated with proof of work hashing. We can get the difference in incentive between these 2 networks by calculating the ratio of the BTC subsidy to the BSV subsidy and see that the monetary incentive to compete for block rewards is approximately 2,970 times greater on BTC than it is on BSV. We will look at Coindance's hash rate chart to see how these 2 incentives affect the hash rate. The long-term chart shows how BTC's hash rate has increased over the last several years. These increases in hash rate are a result of miners' proportional response to increases in the reward. If we zoom in to the average BTC and BSV hash rate for the week prior to our 21 May snapshot, we see that a reward of approximately $334,000 will demand a hash rate near 875 exahashes per second, and a reward of approximately $112 will demand 0.4 exahashes per second. This snapshot gives us a hash rate ratio of 2,186.4, meaning it requires that much more effort to win the BTC block reward than it does to win the BSV block reward. Assuming the cost to produce hashes is consistent, we would expect the block reward and hash rate ratio to be closer. The difference in these ratios is why CoinDance says it was more profitable to mine BTC than BSV on this day. Before we move on to give the cost side of our equation some real-world context, let's note that these variables can be very volatile. Our numbers were not exact. The operating cost to hash rate relationship is likely nonlinear, and this snapshot only gives us one anecdotal data point. To get an accurate representation of the equilibrium, we would need to average a lot of these data points across a long period of time. To give context to the cost side of our equation, we're going to look at some images of Riot Platform's new 1 gigawatt mining facility built on a 265-acre site in Corsicana, Texas. Riot Platforms already operates several other facilities similar to this. The upfront fixed cost of this site will likely be over $1 billion. This gives us a general idea of the size and scale of operations required to compete for an expected block reward worth several hundreds of thousands of dollars every 10 minutes. Because the hash rate equilibrium on BSV was approximately 2,000 times less than BTC, we would expect competitive BSV miners to be profitable with operations approximately 2,000 times smaller than this. Now that we have a better understanding of how the block reward incentivizes miners to expend effort that supports the network, we're going to return to our initial questions and look at how miners reach consensus on what is written to the database. As long as the digital signature for any coin being transferred is correct, and the database does not have a record of that coin already being signed over to someone else, the transaction will be accepted. After a miner finds a proof-of-work solution and broadcasts their block, all other nodes will verify that every transaction in that block is valid and has not already been spent. Mining nodes express acceptance of a block by using the hash from that block to find a proof-of-work solution that builds on top of it. This is how miners reach consensus on what is written to the database. Before we answer our final question, let's watch a short clip of MIT National Defense Fellow and Space Force Major Jason Lowery's presentation on proof of work and its national security implications given at the 2023 MIT Bitcoin Expo. We will take note of a few things he says and then compare his benefit-to-cost ratio equation to ours.
So I'm not here to talk about Bitcoin. I'm here to talk about something that I noticed from my time here that a lot of people weren't talking about within the context of Bitcoin, which is physical security.
Okay.
The role of power projection in society, the role of warfare in society, and how technologies, proof-of-work technologies like Bitcoin could impact that. So real quick, I figured I'd do this old school with just chalk. Physical Security 101. We're going to start off in the first 10 minutes of this talking about physical security. Every organism, every organization, every person, every polity or group of organizations can be physically attacked. There is a benefit to attacking anybody or anything, and we can call that benefit the benefit of attack and represent it with this variable. So there's a benefit of attacking a hive of bees. It's usually the honey. Honey is delicious. There's a benefit of attacking a boar. Boars are delicious. If you've ever tasted them, they're great. Okay, so everything has a benefit of attack. If you want to keep yourself secure, you're going to have to impose a cost of attacking you. Everything also has a cost of attack. So the cost of attacking a boar is you're going to get gored, or you're going to have to try to not be gored. The cost of attacking a beehive is you're going to get a lot of bees stinging at you, okay? So nature optimizes itself to figure out how to reduce its vulnerability, or how to secure itself by imposing a physical cost on those attackers. If you divide the benefit of attacking something by the cost of attacking it, you get what is effectively the return on investment of attacking something, which we can call the benefit to cost ratio of attack. Okay, so if you want to be physically secure, it is your responsibility to reduce the benefit to cost ratio of attacking you. This is how all physical security works.
Lowry and Stronetta both point out how Bitcoin is like all other physical systems. Stronetta explained that Bitcoin can be described in terms of a differential equation, and Lowry emphasizes that Bitcoin is secured by imposing a physical cost of attack. The specific types of attacks Lowry is referring to are known as a double spend attack or an inflation attack. This is when a miner broadcasts a block with invalid transactions that either transfer coins that have already been spent or generate new coins that are not part of the system's subsidy. This brings us back to our third question. How can users of the system trust that the data miners are writing to the timestamp server is valid? We will begin to answer this question by looking at the cost portion of Lowry's benefit to cost ratio of attack equation. To attempt a double spend or inflation attack, the attacker would need to be the first to find a valid proof of work solution. This means that the cost of attack would be equal to the cost of operating a mining node that supports the network. Let's recall that steps 5 and 6 of running the network requires miners to reject or orphan a block if any of its transactions are invalid. An attacker will not receive any benefit if their block is orphaned, and any investment made in finding a proof of work solution will be lost. To handle block concurrency issues, Bitcoin miners consider the longest valid chain to be correct. This means that an attacker or a group of nodes colluding to attack the system could keep their branch going long enough to get away with the benefits of a double spend or inflation attack. This is known as a 51% attack because it would require attackers to invest enough capital to produce more hash power than all the honest miners combined. The white paper addresses this type of attack, saying that anyone who has invested enough to produce 51% of the hash rate ought to find it more profitable to play by the rules than to undermine the system and the validity of his own wealth. We can use our equations to help us understand why the white paper says that this type of attack would undermine the system and the attacker's wealth. The benefit of attack would be equal to the block reward plus the value of any double spends and any new coins that are not part of the subsidy. This would mean that the benefit of attack for any single block cannot be lower than the benefit of supporting the system, and that the benefit to cost ratio of attack would always be greater than the benefit to cost ratio of operating. But we must remember that Bitcoin is a repeated game that has no predefined end. Miners will adjust their strategies to consider long-term consequences. When we look back at the upfront fixed cost of Riot Platform's facilities, their estimated hash rate growth, and past depreciation and amortization, we can see that it will take a significant amount of time for them to realize any return on their investment. Miners will consider this when using backward induction to determine their long-term strategy and come to the conclusion that their profitability is a function of their decision to support or attack the network. They will make a decision based on the expected return on investment. Because block rewards and any benefit from an attack would be denominated in Bitcoin, the expected return on investment will be a function of the value of Bitcoin. The value of Bitcoin is a function of the demand for Bitcoin. The demand for Bitcoin is a function of users' trust and confidence in the system, and users' trust and confidence in the system is a function of miners' trustworthiness. If miners invest enough to produce 51% of the hash rate and decide to double spend or inflate, users will lose trust in the system and demand less Bitcoin. This will drive down the value of any benefits, and attackers will not be able to profit. The large investment required to mine a block is what game theorists call a strategic commitment or a costly signal, because it demonstrates to others that acting dishonestly would never be in the miner's long-term self-interest. Once they have invested enough capital, the cost-to-benefit ratio of operating will always be greater than the cost-to-benefit ratio of attack. Signaling theorists call this point the credibility threshold. So, the objective is not to reduce the benefit-to-cost ratio of attack, but to have a block reward high enough to incentivize miner investment beyond the credibility threshold. This answers our third question of how users can trust miners. Before we conclude this video, let's note the comment Lowry made while explaining the benefit-to-cost ratio of attack about how nature optimizes itself. Economists often use cost-benefit equilibriums to describe how markets naturally reach optimal outcomes. The hash rate equilibrium we described earlier is how Bitcoin intends to optimize the cost of trust in the peer-to-peer system. Stronetta says the real genius of Bitcoin is the embedding of the incentives into the social system, because it gives Bitcoin a game-theoretic differential that ensures miners' dominant strategy will always be to cooperate in support of the network and creates an equilibrium that optimizes the cost of trust. But why was the system created in the first place? Why would anyone want to use the system? What value does it have? What problem does it solve? Is the differential working as intended? In our next video, we will look at the broader purpose and intent of Bitcoin to see what its actual value proposition is.